How's it going, guys? So this video has been a long time coming. It's been quite a bit of work to craft this thing, and then to take the whole long amount of video I ended up with and edit it down, process it, narrate it, all that other stuff, all that fun stuff. So I'm finally getting around to finishing it. So I'm going to show you guys how to build this. The same Tagelharpa, 2-string. You can do 3-string if you want, but this is it right here. What I did for this one is it's a pine body, just some pine boards I picked up at Lowe's, black walnut back. I bought this on eBay. They're 2 pieces that are book matched. So basically that's when you slice a piece of wood down and open it like a book, and then you bond them together with glue and you get that kind of pattern. That's black walnut. You could use any hardwood though. You could use cherry, you could use maple, there's all kinds of maples. There's all kinds of cool maple out there. And you could use more expensive woods. You could probably use some like mahogany. You could use cocobolo is a really nice one, but it's really expensive. It's just it's infinite almost the amount of hardwoods you can use. And there's a few species you could use for the front soundboard. You could do I used red cedar because I like the color of it mostly. You know, it's got that sort of contrast. It's got those reddish pinks in it. But you could use yellow cedar too. You could use spruce. Sitka spruce is probably one of the best materials to use. If you could find it, you could use redwood. There's some suppliers out there that sell redwood soundboard materials online, and you could get some of those. I don't know any names of the sites offhand, but I have seen them for sale. The front, the soundboard is red cedar. I bought this from a website called Alaska Specialty Woods, and they are a company that operates down in southeast Alaska, and they harvest old growth fallen trees. They don't harvest from growing trees. They salvage rather. And I bought this. It was about twice as long, about as long as the instrument itself. I cut another piece off and used it on another project though, and it was $10 for the soundboard material. And then I used a chunk of moose antler on the end here. I picked that up in the woods. I just found a set of moose paddles. I used for the bridge and the tailpiece, that's just scrap black walnut from the back. And I made my own tuning pegs, but I recommend you buy your own. It's a real pain in the ass to make them if you don't have the proper jig, and the jig is like $70, so just buy some tuning pegs. And I'll show you guys how to do that in the video. So now, one more thing is how to make the bow. There's many ways to do this. I went and bought a dowel from a hardware store. It's just a long wooden rod, round wooden rod. And what I did was I soaked this thing in water for about 24 hours. I took it out. I wrapped it in wet paper towels and then wrapped that in foil. I put it in the oven at about, I think it was 200 degrees for about an hour. And what that does is it steams wood and makes it pliable. So what I did was when I pulled it out, I used some gloves, some thick leather gloves, to prevent myself from getting burnt by steam. And I took it out of the foil, and as I did so, I just bent an arc in it and held it in place until it cooled. And then I took and I jammed that down against the floor and jammed the other side against a shelf. And what that did is it held it in place until it dried. And that's how I ended up with this bent piece of wood. Now you could use a piece of driftwood. You can use, you could just buy a strip of pine and just cut one out to shape. It doesn't have to have as drastic of an arc in it. This is just my first bow I've ever made, so that's what I did here. And so once you got a piece of wood that serves as the bow itself, what you're going to do is you're going to take a hank of horsehair. Now, I usually get 2 of them in case I haven't pointed it out before in the video. It's been a while. I've been working on this video for so long, I don't know if I pointed this out already or not, but you buy a 2-pack of horsehair hanks. They're for making bows. They're or bows and stringing your violins. They're not violins, but other instruments, stuff like that. And what it is you buy, I bought 2 for $10 on eBay. and there's a seller on there that sells them at that rate. You'll use one for the bow itself, and then one for the strings on the instrument. So what you do is you take, I drill a little hole in the bow here, and it's just wide enough to accept the hank. And then on this side of the hank, I just tied a knot in it and reinforced it with a drop of super glue. And that keeps it from getting pulled through. So then what you do is, what I did was I took and I carved a notch in the end of this. A flat notch that accepts the hair hank. The hank of hair. And what you do is I laid it across, and then I kind of rigged this up. I just used some rubber band to work as like a grip. Something that would grab the hair and keep it from slipping through. And then I just used some paracord and wrapped it around really tight. And when you do that, you don't want a whole lot of tension. You want some tension on it, but you don't want it to be super tight. You want it to be able to bend down and form to the strings as you play it. Now, what you do before you secure it in that end, you need to take a little comb, and what you're going to do is you're going to brush the hair and get it all straight. You're going to get all the knots out of it. And then what you want to do is you want to comb it flat so that none of the hairs cross each other. You want them all in a straight profile. You don't want them to be crossed or wrapped around each other. You want them to be straight all the way through. And that's why I use a comb and I pull it through. And then that's why there's a flat side on this end, is so it will hold it flat down and keep it from lumping up and rolling over itself and such. So what you do then is you pull it down and you secure it in place. And then that's pretty much all there is to the bow. There's nothing very special about it. All you need is a piece of wood or other material really that'll hold a slight arc in it. And I mean, you can even make it a little longer than this. This is kind of short. I kind of wish I made it a little longer, but I'd say this is about 19 inches long. But I would just go and see how long you can get it. I would aim for 2 feet would be a good length, I believe. So then what you do is you or rather what you need, to sum it up, is you're going to need a piece of wood that holds a little bit of an arc. Like I said, you could cut this out of a board. You could use a piece of dead branch you find down at the beach or in the woods, as long as it's dry. You could use, you could just go cut a piece of a sapling. That would work too if you have time to let it dry. If you have a couple, about a month to let it dry, you could go cut a piece of sapling off of a tree, a little branch, and just kind of tie it into an arc naturally, let it dry that way, and it'll hold its shape. And then you can just make it from that. So you need it to be secured in the frame to where it can hold it flat and hold it in place nice and firmly. And again, not a whole lot of tension. You want some tension, but not a whole lot. And that's about all there is to the bow. To add color to this, I just kind of burnt it with a torch, sanded it down a little bit, and I put some oil on it. And that's all there is to that. So once you got that done, you take your block of rosin. You have to buy rosin too. You can get it online. I bought it on eBay for like $6 for a little block that's going to last a long time. And I get the dark stuff. I heard that's the better formula. There's a clear rosin and a dark rosin. I just get the dark natural stuff. And then what you do is you just kind of hold it so it doesn't pull it through. And then you take the block of rosin and you just apply it to the string, and it'll get kind of chalky looking. And you do that to the strings on the instrument too. You want to put quite a bit of rosin on there. I'll just go ahead and link another video too that actually follows up on that, and it tells you how to do it from a more professional person who's been doing this a lot longer than I have. So I'll go ahead and post that in here too. So thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you take on this project or something similar to it. There's a lot of reasons why you should do that. For one, it's always nice to take up a musical instrument and learn how to play it. And obviously that's something I'm still working on, but I'm getting better. And what you're going to do is when you do this, you're going to be exercising some culture as you're doing this. You're going to be keeping something alive that's dying out. And that's crucial. I think that's absolutely crucial to do. You know, this is a part of the history of our people, and this is a very traditional instrument here that people should be seeking to keep alive. So if you take on this project, you'll be doing yourself a service, and you'll be doing a part of preservation of culture, which I think we can all agree is important. So you do that, you learn how to play it. You never know, you might become a musician and make a name for yourself, you know, make a business for yourself, and you may influence other people too to go ahead and get involved in this and learn more about these things. You might spark some interest, and that'll be a great thing. Now, the other thing too is that these things are there's a way of it attaching to something ancient in you. I've experienced this too, but I had a subscriber tell me in the last video I did when I showed how to build a lyre or a lira, was that when he built it, there was something that was like primal in him that he felt when he was holding it and playing it, and I have experienced that too. So I think that's one of those things about reawakening some ancestral blood memory type stuff, and that alone is a good reason to get into something like this. Now, this wasn't very expensive to make. You know, I bought the backboard. The backing material is probably the most expensive, and that was, I got like 6 pieces, enough to make 3 or 4 backing sets, and I got it for like $35. And then, like I said, the soundboard material was $10 plus like $7 shipping. And then the pine body is just, I mean, like $7 I think at Lowe's. So I mean, it was pretty minimal. The little fine tuners on the end here were like $5 I think for 2 on eBay. And like I said, the tailpiece and the bridge, those are just scrap pieces of the walnut that I used. Instruments like this, people are selling for like $300, $400, maybe even $500. Some people even more. Michael J. King from the UK, who's been making these for years. I mean, his instruments fetch upwards of $1,000 or more for something like this. So there's definitely some money in it. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and like I said, I hope you guys take a project like this up and see what you can get, see how you can get creative with it. You know, like I've said before, it doesn't have to be just like this one either. I mean, you can make it to many different shapes. You could put different curves on it. You could do multiple strings. If you want to do more than just 2, you could do 3 or 4. And I mean, it's really up to you. You can do different colors, different themes. So get creative with it, guys. And that's about it. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave comments, let me know what you thought. If you do build one, I would like to see some in the comment section later on. If you guys would, if you guys feel up for sharing your work, I really get a kick out of that, seeing the work that I've influenced and how I've motivated people to do these things too. It's pretty gratifying. So yeah, I mean, I'd appreciate that if you guys do choose to follow up with a project like this. So anyways, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, be well. Alright, so it starts off with the pine board. This was a piece that was 4 feet long by about 5.5 inches and about a 1/2 inch thick. I have taken and cut a section off here that'll work to double up on the back side as to add depth to the sound body. These boards are advertised at 6 inches, but they measure 5.5 inches, but that ends up being perfect. I buy these boards at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're sold as what is called an appearance board. This is a board that doesn't have any knots or any cracks. It's strictly for high quality crafts applications. The soundboard material I'm going to be using is a piece of red cedar, western red cedar. And I choose this because it's got some nice colors in it. It's going to be a red, pinkish with some brown. And here I'm going to find out where I'm going to cut, because I'm going to actually cut a section out so that it's going to fit together and still retain some of the contrasting browns and reds. And so now I'm going to cut something out of the center. I got to cut some material out of the center so that it lines up right. And this is what I'm going to determine here. Here we have another piece of red cedar, and this is a piece of red cedar from a tree that is anywhere between 300 to 700 years old. You can see a difference in the color. The oils oxidize and change, and also the tonality and the feel of the wood is different. It feels a lot more dense, and it should create a different sound, but we're saving that for another project. This here is Sitka spruce. This is one of the top soundboard woods that people like to use. It works really good. It'll actually project the sound better, while red cedar will create more of a humble, sort of warm sound. But for the sakes of aesthetics, I'm opting for red cedar. Now I'm going to go ahead and start determining where I'm going to cut out the sound body. And here the thing to keep in mind is I'm going to start about 3/8 of an inch in from the edge of the wood, and what this does is it gives me room for error. Basically, if the saw blade jockeys a little bit and cuts at a slight angle, which can happen sometimes, you won't cut too much material off. And also, the way I'm going to be finishing this wood is I'm going to be burning and scraping it, so I need a little extra material in there to compensate for the burning. And here I'm going to go ahead and round off the lower end. You could round it off, you can just kind of sand down the corners and leave it squared off if you'd like. The design is pretty much open to your own liking. It doesn't have to be exactly like how I'm making it, but I'm going to round mine off here. Now I'm going to leave a little extra material here to use as a wall, and what this is going to do is this is going to allow plenty of material for the end piece to be anchored in place. This end piece is what the tail piece is going to attach to, which is going to hold the tension of all the strings. And I got lucky here by adding this extra material, because in the end my soundboards barely cover it. You'll see that later on. So here I'm going to go ahead and drill some pilot holes for the saw blade, so I can go ahead and start with the cutting. Make sure to select a bit that is plenty big enough for the saw blade to fit in. So this here is where the sound body is going to be, and the previous piece is going to cut out the section in between the arms. So now it's time to go ahead and make the cuts. Here I'm just using a cheap jigsaw. I think I paid like $35 for it. And the blade I'm using is a scroll saw type blade. You can use any blade, but I like these scroll saw blades because they provide you to make tighter turns without jockeying the blade around too much and breaking off your blade or making inaccurate cuts. And as always, I save my scrap wood. You never know what use you're going to have. So here I'm just going to go ahead and clean up some of the spots that I didn't quite cut enough material off of. It's much easier to do this now rather than worry about filing and sanding later on down the road. And while I'm at it here, I'm just going to go ahead and take off these corners and round off the top here. Now we begin to remove the section of wood from the sound body. Again, save these pieces. Now we take the second piece and we're going to go ahead and lay out the first one, and we're going to make sure things line up nicely. You want this to not overlap with the opening, but you want it to have enough material to be glued in place. And we're going to go ahead and trace out where we're going to make our cuts. What I'm going to be doing with this piece after the fact is we're going to be gluing it and clamping it in place as to stack the material up to get a deeper sound body. Again, just go ahead and drill some holes, and this will serve as pilot holes to lay your saw blade into. I like to start and go about halfway through on one side and halfway on the other, because as you may learn, pine tends to peel and splinter, and if you just go through one way, you may peel too much material off the backside. Something to keep in mind. Now that we have our pieces cut out, I'm going to go ahead and apply a bead of wood glue along the edges here. This is just standard Titebond wood glue. If you want something more specific to building instruments, go ahead and opt for what is called hide glue, and I believe it's Titebond that makes this as well. And this is what has traditionally been used for string instruments for a long time. And typically it's a little difficult to use, but Titebond has gone and made a form that is just as easy to use as the wood glue is. But in any case, it's what I have on hand for this build, so I'm just going to use this Titebond wood glue. So when you go ahead and clamp these in place, you're going to want to make sure to clamp one corner first, and then make sure everything's still lined up before you clamp the rest of it, because clamps tend to want to pull one side over, especially when there's slippery glue on it. At least that's the case with these cheap clamps. And you want to make sure that everything is evenly clamped under plenty of pressure. You're going to want to leave this for a couple hours, remove it, and let it sit for a while. Generally they say 24 hours, but if you're going to go ahead and just do work like this without a whole lot of stress, then you could do it within a couple hours. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm going to go ahead and remove some material from these soundboard pieces, these book-matched soundboard pieces. I want the brown contrasting edges to be in there because that's where most of the color is. So I need to go ahead and determine where I'm going to cut down the center to remove this material. And I leave about 3/8 of an inch overlapping on the outsides to make it a little oversized. And this is in case the initial cuts are wrong and you have to go back and make more cuts to make sure things line up proper, in case you have to sand it down. So I would just opt to leave a little bit of extra material on the edges, just about what you can see here in the picture, or video that is. Now that I've determined where I want to make my cuts, I go to my table saw. If you don't have a table saw, you could use any other kind of saw. The thing I do here would be to get 2 pieces of flat metal bar, make sure they're lined up, and clamp them around the piece on the inside section of the cut so that you can make a cut with a blade and even sand it or plane it down so you have a straight edge. Now that's a whole nother method, but here I'm just going to go ahead and do the table saw. And here you could also see that the first cut didn't come out right, which is exactly why I leave a little extra material. Also, this what I have going on here is not ideal at all. This is not safe. This isn't the right way to do it. Don't do it like I'm doing it here. Just go ahead and repeat the process for the other side. Now we're going to go ahead and check and make sure that there's enough material here and that the cut was made right, and everything seems to line up right, so seems to be fine. Now, in order to glue these together, you're going to want to take a nice piece of masking tape and lay it across one of the edges, and then you're going to make sure everything lines up right and place the other one on the other half of the tape. You're going to go ahead and mash the tape down, make sure that it's all sealed up, and you can even put a few more pieces of tape on there too. So you're going to open it like a book and put a bead of wood glue in there. You don't need a whole lot, just enough to adequately join it. Just about what we see here. And you'll get a little bit of a bead that comes out, and the best thing to do here is just wipe it off with a wet rag or a clean wet cloth, because otherwise it's going to be hell to clean up once it's dry. Now next I take some of these scrap pieces of wood here, and I've wrapped masking tape around the center, and this is to prevent the glue from sticking to the wood, because it will never come off if you do that. Wood glue bonds wood very, very strongly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that in a few places here. I'm going to apply these clamps here and just put just enough pressure to where you can see some of the glue come out. You just want to have it making contact. You don't want to do it too much as to crack it or buckle it. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a few more bracing pieces. I add them to the ends here to make sure that the ends don't pop up and start to overlap each other or become uneven and dry uneven. So I've left it like this for quite a while, and I go back and remove it. And these pieces are going to be a little stuck to the glue. Don't pry them up, rather try to cock them to the left or the right, and that'll loosen them up nicely without damaging the wood. Now this is what's called a finishing plane. It's just a small plane. I bought it at Lowe's for $13, and this is a very good tool to have. I would say you absolutely need it for this work. We're going to go ahead and use it to remove some material from the soundboard. And you need to find the grain. Obviously it goes one way, but then also it can rise in one direction too. Like think about like the grain of the hair of a dog or a cat. The goal is to go with that grain, not against it, or else you might peel it too much and splinter it. So you just find where it's easiest to plane to and you start working it. Here, this is the inside of the soundboard, and I'm just going to start removing material. And the goal is to get it about 1/8 of an inch thick. I don't have proper measuring tools for this, so I just go by feel. And the board is 1/4 inch to start with, so we're trying to remove roughly half of that material. And it only really needs to be from the internal section and the section that is going to be actually covering the sound body, not the piece that's going to be glued to the soundboard itself, or sound body itself rather. Basically you're just going to remove from the center, but here I flipped it over and I'm going to remove some material from the sides here as to make it more even. It's going to make it more of a arch sort of profile. So you're going to go ahead and just continue to remove material until you have it almost to that point, because you're going to need to sand too, and for that I've used a little piece of the scrap wood as a sanding block, and I use some of this 80 grit sandpaper, and this removes this wood very, very fast. Red cedar is a pretty soft wood, it's pretty easy to work with, and 80 grit makes short work, easy work of it. And because the wood is so soft and this paper is so aggressive, you want to treat it like you would have with planing, because you're going to be removing a lot of material really quick. So keep that in mind. You don't want to go too thin. You're just going to want to try to remove some of the planing marks and get it smooth and leveled down. Now, here what I'm doing is I'm going to be concentrating on the seam, because there's some glue spillover that got in there, and it's embedded in a lot of the wood, and I want to remove as much of that as I can. Otherwise it's going to show up once I go to finish it, and it's not going to look right. And so here I'm just going to take a wet cloth and show you guys what the colors look like. If you want to see what the wood looks like with some basic finish on it, just take a clean cloth and get it wet with some water and just wipe that over the wood and it'll bring out the color. And here you can see the contrast of browns, tans, reds, and pinks. And this is a very beautiful wood, and it's even that much better that it works as a good soundboard material. Now it's time for the backing material, and here I chose some black walnut, and these are book match pieces. You can find them on eBay. I don't remember the seller's name, but they're not hard to find. You just search thin lumber and you could find pieces like this. You could use things like cherry, you could use walnuts, you could use maples. There's a few different kind of woods you can use. Basically any hardwood would work for a backing. And I opted for black maple because I think it's beautiful, and it'll also play with the other colors very well. It'll tie everything together nicely. So here I'm just going to repeat the same process I did for the soundboard. Now, because it's some heavier wood, I'm going to go ahead and add some extra tape just to support the pieces of wood and keep them together a little easier. Now, because the soundboard doesn't overlap completely with this lower portion of the body, I'm just going to go ahead and sand a taper on it before I mount that. You don't want to sand on the section that you're going to be gluing the soundboard to itself. I'm just going to go ahead and give this a nice taper here as to blend it and to compensate for the soundboard material not overlapping all the way. You'll see exactly what I mean. And this will turn out looking much better instead of having it been straight or flush, unsanded. Now here you can see the walnut on the left and the cedar on the right. You can see that these colors actually blend pretty nicely, and these woods are going to be very complementary of each other. Now, pretty much the same with the soundboard. You're going to want to make sure that this wood is evenly lined up. The seam of the wood where we glued it should be in the center of the instrument's body. We're going to go ahead and trace a little extra material on the sides, and we're going to go ahead and start cutting it with the Dremel tool. And this Dremel, I'm using a standard wood blade. It's a little metal blade designed to cut wood with, and you want to cut on the outside of the line, and this provides plenty of material to be worked with so you don't cut too much off.
I run a wet rag around the surface here to open the pores of the wood, and this is going to help the wood soak up more glue. I repeat this process on the backboard material once I have determined which side I want to glue to the body. Now here we're going to follow pretty much the same procedure we did when we glued the two body pieces together. I'm just going to run a bead of glue across, and we're going to lay the backboard on, and we're going to start gradually clamping it from one corner to another, checking in between and making sure that everything still lines up proper.
The world below. I walk into the forgotten past. To the now. Never look back.
In this step, I'm going to be cutting a piece of spruce off of a piece of scrap soundboard material I have. And this is going to serve as what's called the bass bar. It's basically a strip of wood that you glue to the inside of the soundboard. And this helps to resonate the bass frequencies a little more intensely. You don't have to use spruce. This is just what I'm opting to use. You could just as easily use a scrap piece of the cedar that you might have left over from earlier. You could use a scrap piece of the walnut. That might work. That might actually work better, come to think of it, but I'm just opting to use some of this spruce I have here. I'm opting to cut a piece that's about a ½ inch wide, and this is going to work perfect because this is going to fit down into the sound body without contacting the backboard, and that's what you're looking for. You want it to be long enough to resonate some sound, but you don't want it too long, and you don't want it too short either, else it's not really going to do its job. So here I'm going to go ahead and sand the edges. I'm going to sand down the cut section so it's nice and smooth, and I even give it sort of a blade shaped edge. Now I don't know if that actually helps with the sound or not. I don't know much about these parts, to be honest. I just know that they put them in all other string instruments like violins and cellos, so the same logic applies to this instrument, so I'm going to go ahead and add it.
I was here a moment ago. I am home.
Now, before you go ahead and glue the bass bar onto the soundboard, you want to go ahead and make sure that where you glue it's not going to interfere with anything. You want to make sure that you're gluing it high enough up so that it doesn't contact the body, and likewise for gluing it low enough down so it doesn't contact the body itself, the sides. And we're going to go ahead and add a bead to the bass bar here. So we go ahead and you're going to place it where you have already chosen to glue it. And what I do is I take some strips of masking tape, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put masking tape over the base bar and around the front of the soundboard. And I'm going to do a few of these first, and I'm going to double up on them, because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be coming back through and putting clamps around the tape itself, and that's just going to pull it down a little better. It's going to make it more snug against the soundboard, and you'll see what I mean. Alright, now that should do it. You're going to want to leave it like this for a couple hours, and it should do plenty well job gluing that piece together. Now, the next step is to cut and form what is called a sound peg, and this is like what violins have as well. This is basically just a piece of wood that helps to resonate the sound from the soundboard down to the backboard, and it helps to resonate sound throughout the body of the instrument. And what it also does is it forms as a support and keeps the soundboard from crushing in on itself under the tension of the strings once it's strung up. It has a lot of pressure on it. And I'm using a piece of leftover spruce here. You can use a piece of wooden dowel, or really whatever you have on hand. Even a piece of that scrap pine you saved earlier, though I'm not sure if pine will help to resonate the sound very well, but I'm just going to go ahead and sand it down, make sure it's nice and smooth on the sides. And what I'm also going to be doing is I cut it a little oversized. Keep that in mind, you want to cut it just a little bigger than you think you need it. And what we're going to be doing is fitting it. We're going to be making sure that we can put it in place, put the soundboard down on top, and we're going to hold the soundboard down as if it's glued down to check the pressure. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick up the instrument while we're holding it, and we're going to just gently tip it around and make sure that it doesn't fall out of place. And this is why I leave it a little long, so that I could go back and shave some off if I need to until I got it just about right. As for the placement, you're going to want to go right underneath where the bridge is going to be, and I determined it's going to be about right there. So I'm going to go ahead and mark, and you're going to want to go just a couple of millimeters below the bass side string. That's going to be the thickest string, which is typically the one that's going to be furthest away from you when you play. And we're going to go ahead and set it down in place and put this board on there, pick it up and move it, and make sure it still stands up. Didn't there, but we're going to go ahead and try again to see what happens. And it looks like we need to cut a new one because I believe I sanded too much material off. And now when you're testing this, you want to make sure that you lay the board on flat and you don't slide it around, or else it might fall over and you might think that you have a wrong size peg. You also don't want it to be too long either, or else it could crack the board when you go to put tension on it when you string it up. And that's not good either. That's just as bad as not having one. Now, if you know it's about long enough and you just can't get it to stand up, you're not supposed to glue them in place, but I ended up doing this anyways, I believe on this instrument. If not, it was another one I built. And what I ended up doing is just taking a dab of super glue and putting it on the bottom side when I stand it up, leave it in place to get it, make sure it's glued in place, and then I just went ahead and put the soundboard on, and it seems to work fine. And as you can see, that peg is long enough. Now I'm going to go ahead and pre-sand this lower piece of the soundboard as to make the fade match the body a little better. Make it look more, well, it's going to blend better. It'll look better. And now you really don't have to even take these steps. They're not entirely necessary. Some people like the more rustic look. I wanted a more professional look here. I was going with more of like a old red violin kind of look. So I just put a little extra effort into this one. And again, we're going to follow the same procedure for gluing. The only thing different this time is we got to be very careful not to knock that peg over as it sits in place and we try to clamp it, which can be a little difficult. In that case, I would just say go ahead and put a little dab of super glue on the peg and just glue it to the back of the soundboard anyway. Or I'm sorry, not the soundboard, but you want to glue it to the backboard. And so now that everything's glued in place, I'm going to go ahead and take this Dremel and cut these excess board pieces off. And once everything's glued, you want to go ahead and go slow and steady with it. You don't want to rush it and crack anything or cut too much off at this point. Now you're going to go ahead and sand off the edges and round it out and make sure that it blends. It rolls together nicely, and the grains are nice and joined. And if you don't have an orbital sander like this, you can either you can go out and buy one for about $30, or you can just use sandpaper and do it by hand, which isn't a bad way either. Start with a higher grit and then work your way down to a finer grit. I would start with an 80, and over the course of probably 3 different kinds, I would just go to a 220. I would do something like an 80, like a 160 and then a 220. Okay, now here I'm just going to carefully trim some of this overlapping edge off, and just ever so slightly. It's just going to be the smallest cuts. Now, as you're rounding all this off and shaping it with the sandpaper, now is the time to make sure you get any of the excess glue off that may have spilt onto the body and dried in place. You want to get that out of the way, because if you decide to stain it or dye it or whatever you're going to be doing, it is going to get in the way and affect the finish. And now here I'm going to apply some water on a wet rag, and this is also going to expose where glue is. It's going to expose where some deeper scratch marks might be, basically some pieces that some sections and parts that I may need to work when I need to sand down a little better. And also, when it comes to this stage here, I wouldn't use the orbital sander. I'm just going to be sanding it by hand for the most part, unless it's got some very, very rough texture. And I believe I end up doing this to the back piece. I hit it with some 220 on an orbital sander. And also another note, when working with an orbital sander, you don't want to move it across the surface too quick. You want to let it sit and do its thing, or else you're going to end up with swirl marks. So basically what you're doing is you're going to take the orbital sander and you're going to move it across the wood at a rate of about an inch per second. And that's going to be good enough to more often than not avoid the little swirly marks that you'd otherwise get, which can be a huge pain in the ass. You might not even see those until you've applied your finish. Okay, and now, so here I'm going to go ahead and finish rounding off the body and the ends and the sides here. I'm going to finish sanding off the glues and getting it prepped for the next stage. Alright, now this is one of my favorite parts. This year we're going to be burning the wood. We're not going to be burning the soundboard or the backboard. We're just burning the body, the pine. And this is a Japanese method. This is a Soshugi ban, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Basically, we're going to be charring the wood and scraping the char off with a wire brush. And this is going to add some texture. It's also going to bring out some colors, and it's also going to make, I believe it makes the wood harder. And that's going to be good because this is pine, relatively soft wood. Now you want to be careful because these soundboard materials are very soft, very dry, and very light wood, so they can be very flammable. So you're going to make sure that you don't contact your flame with that. You're going to end up getting it close enough anyways that it's going to put a little bit of a char on it, but that's okay. If it gets a little bit of color, it's just going to make it blend a little better. And so what I found with burning this pine is it's pretty hard to burn too much off. You want to hold the flame in place and get a really nice char going. You're going to see the wood cherry up and kind of stay on fire, and that's good. That's what you're looking for, and that's when you know that you've done enough. Now, burning the sides can be especially tricky because this is where you're going to risk overlapping onto the soundboard or backboard materials the most. So this is where you're going to want to move very controlled and slow. And as you can see there, I already burnt the side of the soundboard material. Now, as I said before, a little bit of burn's okay. Try not to burn it. You're going to end up getting a little bit of burn, but as long as you try not to deliberately burn it and you try to avoid it, and you do get some burn on it, that's about the sweet spot there. That's going to be okay, because like I've already said, it's just going to add a little more. It's going to blend it a little better, and you can always sand off a little bit of that charring after we're done here. So here we're going to go ahead and scrape the char off, and I got a steel brush from the painting section at the hardware store. This thing was like $3, and I moved back and forth in the same areas, and I scrape off the char, but I scrape very vigorously as to get the wires in between the grain of the wood, and that just brings out more texture in the wood. It creates more little cavities and grooves, and this gives it a really nice feel. And you can see there, you're gonna want to scrape with the grain of the wood. Don't go against it. And that's gonna make it look unnatural. Now, be sure to get everywhere that you've charred. You just want to make sure you go with the grain always. And like I said, vigorously, back and forth, same spot, until you've gotten all the char off and then some. And it's still gonna be colored, and that's just fine. But the goal is to get all the old char out of the place in preparation for finishing. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and wipe some of the char off with a moist rag. We're going to get that out of the way. You can also use the air nozzle on an air compressor and blow some of that out of there, get it out of the texturing that we just made from scraping out the wire brush. You're going to want to just go ahead and get as much of that off as you can, and it should come off pretty easily. Now, the soot from the char has gotten into some of the scratches that were on the soundboard and revealed them. I hadn't recognized they were there before, so here I'm just going to go ahead and hit it with some finer grit sandpaper, and this is also going to remove any of the discoloration that may have been caused to the soundboard itself from the charring process. Now, once we've sanded, we can apply some more water to it. This is going to raise the grains. This is going to help to expose some spots we may have missed. You can go ahead and do this a few times. This wood's going to dry back out pretty quick as long as you just wiped it with a moist rag. But always do this. It's going to reveal some places that you didn't know that you skipped. Okay, now we're going to stain the body, and here I'm using this Express Color by Minwax. It's just a water-based stain. You just wipe it on, let it sit for a few minutes, and wipe it off, and it does its thing. It's very easy to use, cleans up very easily. It was, I think, about $7 a tube, which is more than plenty for one instrument. Here I'm going to go ahead and do a test run. This is a piece of pine that I've already burnt and scraped, and I'm going to go ahead and apply the stain and see how it turns out. Being satisfied with this color of the stain, which will tie this instrument together very nicely, I'm going to go ahead and start dyeing it now. And there I want to be careful. I don't really want to get it on the soundboard or the backboard. I just want to stain the pine body. So I'm going to have to get in here and be very careful when you get close to the soundboard. Now, with the body stained, I go ahead and move on to oiling. Now, this oil is a special blend. I took some spruce resin, some spruce sap, and I dissolved it in denatured alcohol. I then strained this to filter out the impurities and mixed it with some linseed oil. The ratio was about 1 part of the filtered and strained resin and denatured alcohol blend to 4 parts of linseed oil. Now, you could just use the oil too if you want. I just chose to experiment with this resin because I had read that there is more resins in violin finishes. And now I just choose to finish it with this, but if you wanted to finish it with something that will give it a truly shining finish, almost like it looks here while it's wet, I would go ahead and buy a nice can of spray lacquer and use some spray lacquer after this oil has cured and dried. Now, applying oil to the walnut back here has actually shown some curl in the wood grain that I didn't know was there, which is that kind of tiger stripe kind of barring you see going across the section of wood. And that's just a bonus, it just adds more character. Now, while that's drying and curing, I've went and cut a piece of moose antler off of some moose paddles I found. You don't have to use this. You could use different things. You could use a piece of cow horn. You can use a wooden dowel. It doesn't really matter. What this basically is it's going to serve as an anchoring point for the cording that's going to tie the tailpiece in place, which is going to bear the tension of the strings once it is strung. Here I'm just going to go ahead and sand this until it's fairly smooth. And, well, at least this is going to take the marks from the saw. It's going to remove those deep scratches. But it won't by any means polish it. The next step is to drill a hole about halfway into it, as straight as you can. And what this is going to do is this is going to serve an anchoring point for a screw. We're going to go ahead and tap a screw in there, but you don't want the screw to go in too tight, but you just want the threads to grab. So you want to make sure it's just big enough for that. For drilled to accept a screw, I'm going to go ahead and mix up a little bit of epoxy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some of this epoxy onto the front of the screw. And then I'm just going to go ahead and tap it down into the antler. And this should provide plenty of epoxy to secure that screw in place. So I start putting the screw in by hand, and then I will finish off using a screwdriver to make sure that it's anchored in nice and firm. You don't want it to go in all the way. You need plenty of screw sticking out to anchor it into the body of the instrument as well. With the screw mounted into the antler, I go ahead and start with the polishing process. For this I'm just using a polishing bit on a Dremel and some polishing compound. And basically I'm just trying to get a little bit of a shine to this, as well as remove some of the finer scratch marks from the sandpaper. Now once the end is polished, you could even do something creative like a scrimshaw, where you etch a design into it and backfill in the design with ink or any other pigment. Now, once the antler is polished, you go ahead and either clip or saw off the head of the screw. In this case, I happen to have used a pair of heavy-duty wire clippers. Now, the next step is to apply some epoxy to this other end of the screw and go ahead and thread it down into the body of the instrument. You want to make sure you get it nice and snug and then carefully remove any excess epoxy without smearing it around. So the next step is to choose a material to make the bridge with. So on the left I have some leftover cedar, the middle I have black walnut, and on the right I have some hemlock. I choose to go with the walnut. Now the slices I used, they're only 1/8 of an inch thick, so what I ended up having to doing after the fact was double it up and glue it together to get a 1/4 inch wide piece, because the bridge wouldn't stand up. It kept falling over in the middle of playing it, so heads up, go ahead and take 2 pieces and glue and clamp them together before you start making your bridge. That is to say, if you use some of the thin black walnut or whatever your backing material is. I assume you may be doing this because you will have some scrap leftover material from making the back piece. So on this piece of walnut, I'm going to go ahead and draft up a rough shape of the bridge, and then we'll go ahead and cut it out with a Dremel and finish it with a sanding wheel and the Dremel. Taking a round wood cutting wheel, I go ahead and cut out the rough shape of the bridge. So the next step is to take the same cutting wheel and add some shape to this. So first I cut off the corners to give it a taper, and then I'll go ahead and just use the side of the blade to carefully and slowly give it a curve. I cut into it to give it another notch and add more characteristic, and you could really just build this any way you want. You don't have to do it exactly like I had. You could just do a simple arch type shape, like a half circle or similar to that. You could just leave it as a square too, or a rectangle. Next, I continue to add more shape to it and work it down to a more desirable arc. I'm going for more of a arch kind of curve shape here. Now once that's been achieved, you can go ahead and sand on it a little bit more. Next I take and make a couple of marks where I'm going to cut some notches for the strings to sit. You want these to be spaced out properly. You want them to match the tailpiece, so whether you make the tailpiece first or the bridge, that's something to keep in mind. You don't want the gaps on the bridge here being closer together than the holes on the tailpiece, or else the strings aren't going to fit right. Alright, so next I'm going to go ahead and cut some walnut to make a matching tailpiece. Now, I cut 2 pieces and I glue them together to add some more strength to the tailpiece. It needs to withstand pressure from the fine tuners or strings, if you don't use fine tuners, as well as the strings that will be tying it to the anchoring point, or the antler, as I used in this particular instrument. With the two pieces matching, I go ahead and apply some wood glue, and I will end up clamping these together for a couple hours. Alright, so now we are going to cut out a sound hole. Now, you could just do one circular sound hole, about 1 inch in diameter. You could do 2 smaller ones, about a 1/2 inch in diameter. Or you could do some more intricate designs. So here I'm using some ancient European sun wheels. Now, I'm using these designs because they have a far deeper and more rich history in European culture than people may be assuming. People have been so trained to be put off by this symbol because it's been vilified. This symbol has been given this attribute due to a short 12-year period of German history back in the 20th century. However, this symbol has tens of thousands of years of European history and is tied to many European cultures. I'm going to go ahead and link a video in the description which goes into much deeper detail of this, and I highly recommend that people watch it, especially if they are somehow offended by this symbol. This symbol was not stolen from other cultures, as we're often told. This symbol has been used by our people for thousands and thousands of years, as well as other people. So when you go to cut out a sound hole design like this, you just want to use a small round engraving wheel on a Dremel, and you want to go slow and shallow at first. Just go over the whole design very shallow, and then go back over it again very little bit at a time, again being shallow, and then eventually you will get through the soundboard. Now if you go too much at once and you try to force it through, you're going to end up you could end up cracking the soundboard, or you can put too much pressure on the bit and it will start to travel across the soundboard and tear it up really bad, and you do not want to do that. So just move slow and steady until you get through the soundboard material. Now, with the majority of the material removed, I just go back through and slowly clean out and remove some little detail spots that I may have missed. Next, we're going to go ahead and drill some holes for the tuning pegs. You don't want these to be too close to each other, but you don't want them to be too far away from each other that it's awkward to play. If they're too close to each other, it's going to be difficult for the tuning pegs to operate. They're going to end up touching each other. You're going to be unable to tune them without them hitting each other and interfering. So you start off with a slow bit. I tend to go halfway through one side, flip it over, and then try to go the other. Pine has a tendency of tearing if you get a drill bit to go through all the way. So I tend to switch it up. Now, if it does tear a little bit on you, you can always just go back through and apply a little bit more stain to it after the fact and cover it up pretty well. But you want to go gradually bigger in the bits until it gets big enough, well, just big enough for the tip of the reamer to fit into. And then that is where we will continue to size it and fit it for the sound pegs. Okay, so when you start to ream out the holes, you want to go ahead and start off slow and keep it steady. You want to make sure that you're doing this straight, because you do not want it to jog you around and come through crooked. This will result in the tuning pegs coming through at an odd angle. So you want to go ahead and periodically check and make sure that everything looks good and it's lined up properly. If not, you can always make some adjustments as you are reaming the holes out. See here, it's off one angle. All you gotta do is push it in the opposite direction as you ream, and you should correct it, but be careful. You don't want to end up with more of a mistake than a correction. Now, we're going to go ahead and work on the tailpiece. I usually do a oval profile, but you could do more of a rectangle or a square or a circle. It really doesn't matter. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and determine where I need to cut this excess off. I decided to end up doing more of a sort of angled, like elongated triangular type shape, if that makes any sense. So you want to go ahead and use the cutting wheel on the Dremel, and you go ahead and just slowly work through the pieces of wood, keeping them as even as possible. Alright, and so here I'm going to go ahead and use a round grinding wheel, a metal grinding wheel. You just want to go ahead and take the edges off, bevel it down, kind of round it out, give it some nice aesthetic angles, and just go ahead and work it until you're satisfied with the appearance and shape of it. Like I said, I mean, there's really no specific way to make these parts. In terms of shape, really all it needs to do is fit some holes for some cord to anchor it down to the instrument itself, and then a couple of other holes for the strings or the fine tuning pegs, or rather fine tuners, that is. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and drill some holes in which the fine tuners can fit. You take off the brass fittings and you need to find a bit that corresponds with the diameter of the fine tuners. So I go ahead and find a bit that works, and I drill 2 holes into the tailpiece. Now on the opposite side, I go ahead and drill 4 holes, which will serve as holes to lace some paracord through, as to anchor this piece to the instrument. So the next step that I take is to drill some very small holes through the ends of the tuning pegs, about a good 1/4 inch down from the end. This will serve as holes to feed the twisted horsehair strings through and keep them from unraveling as you tighten it down and feed the horsehairs onto the tuning pegs. And now here I take about 1.5 foot of parachute cord, and I'm going to go ahead and lace it through the 4 holes on the bottom. What I like to do is I'll start with the back side of the tailpiece, and I'll do the upper holes, and I'll go through each side there, and then I'll cross them over on the other side and then go through the lower holes so that the strings come out the back side of the bottom of the tailpiece. And if that doesn't make any sense, you'll see what I mean here in a second. Now you're going to need to tie a knot into the parachute cord so that it will hold itself in place around the anchoring material on the bottom of the instrument. I usually like to take just enough material so that the tailpiece is just lying flat over the soundboard. You don't want to be up too high, but if you need to make adjustments, you always can. I just choose to go with a shorter length of cord. Now is the time to start counting out some individual horsehairs to make your strings with. For the upper string, the string closest to you when you're playing, you're going to need less strings. So I count out about 25 to 30 hairs for that string. And then the lower string, the bass string, if you will, is going to be about 35 to 40 hairs. And that's how you're going to make these strings. So you count them out, you're going to put a little dab of super glue on the end and twist it to lock them in place. This is just going to hold them all together so you can cut it from the hank without all the hairs falling out. You're going to go ahead and do this to each one. Give it a second to let the glue dry, and then you can go ahead and cut. Now, once your strings are cut, you're going to go ahead and tie a knot in the end, and then you're going to reinforce that with super glue. The reason I'm doing this is because of the way that the fine tuners are set up. You don't tie the string around the fine tuners. The fine tuners are designed so that there's a bead or a knot on the end of the string that simply slides in between two blades on each tuner, and that's what holds the string. This is why I'm tying a knot on the ends and reinforcing it with super glue. Next thing you're going to want to do is take some of the oils out of the horsehair. So what I do is I get a rubbing alcohol soaked paper towel and I just run the hairs through this, and this will pull any of the oils off of the hair. Step is to go ahead and put these strings in place. To do this, you want to snap the knot on the other side of either of the two blades of the fine tuner so that it holds the string in place. Then you want to go ahead and twist the strings. You want them to go in the same direction, so if you twist one clockwise, you want to twist the other one clockwise, or if you do one counterclockwise, you want the other one counterclockwise too. Next, I add a little bit of super glue to hold the hairs together while I go ahead and clip the excess off. After I cut the excess off, you go ahead and you feed the hairs through the tuning pegs. Next step is to go ahead and tune it. You're going to want to do, for the string closest to you, you're going to want to go ahead and go with, say, a G, and then the lower one you want to do a C or maybe a D. This is a good place to start. You go ahead and apply rosin and you're good to go.